Okay, so let's do into yourself now. So my name's Paul. I'm the Enrichment and Diversity Officer for Gower College, and we've kindly got our friend Mike O'Brien here today to talk a little bit about mental health and the impact that our, say, digital revolution has been having on it. So I just want to first of all say thanks very much, Mike, for doing this. Greatly appreciated. I'm sure all the students are going to be loving it.
That's no problem. Thanks for the opportunity. This first time I've done a podcast, so this is going to be an interesting experience.
Yeah, mate, this could be your ticket to star, mate. Ticket to stardom.
Well, I've always tried to keep a low profile, right? Okay, so we have to see about that one. I'm not sure.
All right. So I'm just going to kick off here. So, what was it about, the topic of, mental health in general that kind of got you interested in it?
Well, I've been working at the college about 20 years. In my capacity, I suppose, working as a lecturer, as a tutor, come across a lot of students. You have a lot of face time with students. And about 7 years ago, an approximate time frame that, I started to notice a change in some of their behaviour. And more young people, which are broadly, I suppose, for me, 16 to 19-year-olds, started talking to me about feeling anxious, feeling stressed. And what goes with anxiety and stress often is avoidance. And that would make sense to me in that if you look into and strip back what anxiety is, it's something in the distant past that's probably helped humans stay safe by being very cautious. So the idea of people avoiding when they're anxious, I do get that. But it was about 7 years ago, I noticed a real shift. And there was such an increase in the number of young people, which has kept going over the last 7 years, and it's increased every year, talking to me about feeling stressed, feeling anxious. And you talk to other members of staff as well, that's been sort of replicated. And when you're working with young people, I think, you spend so much time around them, you empathize when you feel what they feel. And I thought, look, we can't ignore this situation, but I also was felt, right, I need to understand why. It's in my nature, maybe, with a psychology background, to understand why. So that's how I became interested in the issue of sort of health and mental health, and then technology, because I was searching for answers. And this is where I came across some research by Dr. Jean Twenge, and her work is based on samples in America, but I still think it applies here. There's a lot of cultural similarities between the UK and the US. So this is when I started to hypothesize that there may be a link here between young people's use of technology and smartphones and their sort of worsening mental health.
Nice. And it is, I think what you said, that increase it's not just a marginal, isn't it? It has just blown up over the last 13, 14 years. And I think that link that you've mentioned there between, digital technology and the rise of mental health, it's no coincidence that, this has all started from roughly 2008 when the smartphone kind of first came out. It's just been building upon that, really. So I think you've definitely found something there. So, what would you say then is is the relationship then between actual physical health and then mental health?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. When I was younger, I've got to acknowledge, right, I hadn't thought much about health. I suppose at the time for me, it was, just about eating low-fat food, which we were told to do a lot, and going to the doctor if you felt unwell. And nobody really talked about mental health. I think as I've got older through experience, I've learned a lot more about these issues, and I realize how complex they are. Health does mean different things to different people, but to answer your question there about health and mental health, I don't think we can separate mind and body. There's a constant exchange of information between what we call the body and the mind. And I think we need to view health in what we call a holistic way, in a very sort of interconnected way. So, for example, I know for myself that if my sort of musculoskeletal health is good, so if I haven't got any back pain, for example, or my hamstrings feel good and strong, kind of thing, then generally, okay, I'm quite active, I sleep better, and then generally when I've slept better, I seem to feel a lot better. So there's a link, I think, here between the mind and body that we can't escape. The other thing that has struck me is I think there's a difference between health and disease. And whilst I don't want to get this too heavy, and I'm certainly not an expert in this particular area, I think this idea that we live in a healthy or unhealthy society, often I think what we're talking about is a state of disease. So if we invest in our health, for example, right, if we maintain good musculoskeletal health, nutritional health, our self-esteem is good, our sleep health is good, you know what, generally we can say we're quite healthy. But that in itself doesn't mean, I suppose, that we are not then potentially leading to a state of disease. I think it protects us to some degree. So whilst I don't want to make that too heavy there, I think ultimately the relationship between health and mental health, I think we need to talk about health more rather than just mental health. And mind and body is very much interrelated. And I think we mustn't confuse health with a state of disease, which is, you know, something a little bit different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you know that word holistic really sums it up for me. And like we know that, you know, kind of like almost the one thing that's 100% to improve your mood is exercise, particularly cardiovascular exercise. You know, and you look at that just on the way of that. I find, I know about you, but if you're going for a run, you tend to get in that headspace where you're not really thinking of anything. You kind of like zone out, and you have that real period of mindfulness.
Yes.
And then you've got obviously the chemical side of it then as well, where, you know, you get that release of endorphins. You know, it dampens down cortisol, which is the stress hormone. You know, so really, I completely agree with you that you cannot just look at one without the other. And that whole idea of we need to be looking really about the overall well-being of our health, you know, and preventative rather than doing that damage control.
Yeah, I think there's a key word you've mentioned there, Paul, is prevention. And the idea of, I think, investing in our own health in a variety of ways. And you mentioned exercise there, for example, and being mindful, two things I think are really important for us. But I think if we proactively invest in that aspect of our health, you know, generally speaking, I think we can protect ourselves from something much worse further down the sort of road. But I think as a society, we're probably trapped in this mode of, well, I'll wait until I'm unwell and maybe approaching a state of disease, and then I'll take action. And I think inevitably then it's creating problems for us in that way. I feel probably the best healthcare system is one we don't need. And that is just a turn of phrase. You know, we all need access to support. But ultimately, if we kind of take it on ourselves, I think ultimately we're empowering ourselves to kind of stay out of trouble, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's probably, you know, it must be quite frustrating for health professionals as well when you think that, you know, the current situation of the NHS isn't really sustainable, is it? You know, if everyone's waiting to the point then where they're needing, you know, pretty specialist care and expensive care, they're always going to be like chasing their wheels, you know, you just can't get on top of it. So it needs to be something, like you said, that societal shift, I guess. But I guess part of the problem is, you know, how do you implement that? Where does that start?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, you know, health, I think for me, and again, it does mean different things to people, but health is something we can potentially control and influence. So, you know, making sure we sleep well, making sure we get some, you know, light exercise, making sure we manage our stress. Our diet is critical, you know, looking after our musculoskeletal health. We can do all these things ourselves without necessarily having expert advice on it. All right. Obviously, you know, if you've got it available to you, you might tap into that. I think the point where we do get then to a state where maybe we are becoming unwell, almost a state of disease, that's where we do need the specialist help potentially. And it's not to say that we don't need expertise for health. We do, I think, but I think it's something we can take on ourselves. And when it comes to mental health, I think that's my really sort of go-to message is, look, take it on yourself. Rather than wait for something to happen where you feel you can't cope and you really are desperate for help, I suppose. But we all know how important it is that we then seek out help when we need it to as well. I think that's another really important message.
Yeah. So we talked pretty much during the introduction then about, you know, mental health in particular seems to have like blown up over the last, you know, 6 or 8 years. You know, we've got a lot of people talking about it. I've got a lot of celebrities endorsing, you know, take care of yourself, but it's still rising. It's still getting worse. So, you know, what do you think that is? Why do you think that's happened over these last, you know, 6 to 8 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you look at the UK, and I suspect, you know, this is quite widespread across the UK, irrespective of where you live. we've seen a big increase in the number of young people reporting an increase in stress and anxiety. And I want to clarify something here. This is self-reported. So what I mean by that, this increase isn't necessarily something that falls into a clinical range. All right, that might require a medical intervention. It's been reported, self-reported by young people. And I think this is related to the changes technologically, culturally that have occurred over a period of time. And whilst we've seen cultural, technological changes occur over a long period beyond 6 to 8 years, I think the manifestation, the impact of it's been felt the most over the last 6 to 8 years. And I think if we look at different generations, which is, it is less than ideal that, but if we compare different generations, we can see, I think, some stark patterns emerging. And this is why I think we need to look at this idea of the iGen generation. Whilst that label, some people will like it, some people won't. I think understanding the impact of technology and the cultural changes have gone with it, I think would explain why we've seen this such an increase in the last 6 to 8 years.
Interesting. Do you think that that's kind of gone hand in hand to that access to technology? Because it feels now like everyone is very busy all the time, and it's just they're constantly feeling like, oh, I've got this on, I've got that on. There's always that fear, that FOMO, fear of missing out on something. And do you think that's just because we're more connected now with technology, so we can, it's easier to plan events or plan visits to people, and it's almost like you're just dependent on that?
So, good question. You think about that one. There's no doubt this technology is very, very well designed, and it's designed to hold our attention, which it does incredibly well. But of course, there is a benefit to that, but there's also a huge cost to it. I suppose the benefit is potentially it does connect us. So I've got some friends, a couple of them, we live in South Africa, and generally speaking, I wouldn't have any contact with them, I don't think, if it wasn't for technology and something like WhatsApp. But there is a downside to it, I think, particularly for young people who've grown up with the technology and maybe don't know any other way, that it holds our attention in such a way that it's having an adverse effect through the changes, the rippling effect that causes in other aspects of their life. And I suppose, the things that you would normally do face to face, meeting friends, connecting with people, having a conversation, reading their body language, reading their facial expressions, these things, I suppose, aren't occurring when our head is in technology. But I think it's very, very well designed. It does hold our attention. And I think what I would sort of like to get on to talk about really is a little bit of the work that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Jean Twenge and her work from America on the iGen generation. So I think when we strip back some of her messages, I think they would apply in the UK as well.
Okay, so I'm guessing that I've not really heard that term iGen before, but I'm guessing it's the pretty much the first kids to have like an iPhone while they're growing up, or.
Yeah, so it's something that was new to me up until I come across this researcher's work. So we can look back to maybe the baby boomers, and these people were born between 1946 and 1964. There's a broad classification that we've had Generation X, millennials since, and this iGen generation. And it is a fairly new, I suppose, label that. We're born after 1995. And the first generation to own a smartphone during adolescence. And whilst technology has been evolving a long time before that, this is the first generation that's growing up at a critical age period, having access to a smartphone and being very occupied with a smartphone and the technology that surrounds it. And I think it's had a rippling effect on different aspects of their lives. But I think by comparing different generations, what it allows us to do is to draw meaningful conclusions, because some of the patterns that we've talked about today that other people, I'm sure, can see themselves. If we didn't have a comparison to the previous generation, it wouldn't mean a lot, because you could think, well, maybe this happens all the time. But actually, when we compare different generations, we can see some stark differences. So what Twenge talks about in her work, and she's a psychologist, she believes deterioration in adolescents' mental health is associated with changes in the use of technology. So her work is based on large-scale national surveys. So we're talking large samples here with different generations. It goes all the way back to the 70s. By making the comparisons between generations, we can see, and Twenge has seen as a psychologist, some big changes in the data, particularly since 2010. And these changes have been very sudden. So for example, if you look at the graphs that she cites, all right, and these surveys, teens are much less likely to go out with parents. They must, spend less time with friends. Certainly there's more of them reporting feeling left out, lonely, feeling less useful, not enjoying life. And this has been associated, and I choose that word carefully, big changes in certain mental health markers like increases in feeling anxious, depressed. But all of this was associated with big changes in the amount of time that young people were spending online on social media. And interestingly, this didn't correlate with changes in things like the economy, because at this time in America, the economy was actually growing. So a lot of things were going the right direction, but the things that were going the wrong direction all correlated with this increased use of technology. So that was, that's her work really. I hope that sort of answers that sort of question a bit about those generations and what the impact has been really.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, hearing that and hearing that, let's say young adults now, and people they're on their phones or their devices, so they're spending less time with their friends. But I guess in some ways, though, it's almost like they are spending more time with their friends, but they're not getting that physical interaction. And it's interesting there where they say that they don't feel particularly useful and not enjoying life. And I wonder if having that device, which is pretty much, if you ask me, that tool of instant gratification, if you want to find something out, you have a supercomputer in the palm of your hand, you just find it. And you're constantly, it seems like, being just overstimulated without any time to be bored or any time to actually, do something, actually physical. So you don't really have what it feels like that level of positive stress to overcome. And I feel like that needing to overcome something or do something is probably like quite a big pillar of my happiness. Like I always feel much more happy if I'm working on a problem and I'm solving that, rather than just in that constant living in la la land. I don't really have anything to do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, that, isn't it? You mentioned the word gratification there, that things are instant, and if you want to learn something, you just turn to your phone. In a lot of ways, you don't have to remember anything now. If you want to make arrangements, for example, to go out with friends, 20 years ago, you might have had to speak to them face to face, and you had to commit to being somewhere because you had no way to contact them to say you couldn't make it. Now it changes. So you're living, I suppose, very much on the hoof, then I would call it, just constantly on the go. And I think there's an important role here of something called dopamine. Is one of the neurotransmitters in the brain. So when our brain anticipates something quite pleasant might happen, it starts building up dopamine levels. And if we do something we believe is pleasurable, it floods our brain with dopamine. I suppose the technology itself is the overstimulation you mentioned is potentially overstimulating that sort of system in the brain. And we might be even moving to a place where we are almost dopamine insensitive. Now, the actual basis of that, I can't tell you whether that is definitive or not, or whether there's enough empirical evidence, but, it would make sense logically, wouldn't it, that is happening, But I think alongside some of these changes that I mentioned, I think it's worthwhile pointing out to you, I don't think it's simply a case of if we use technology or have a smartphone, which most people now do, certainly in the UK, it's not automatically going to lead to a worsening of someone's health and mental health. I think the impact of technology is more complex than that. It appears to have a gradual and I think eroding effect. It's chipping away at things. And that, for that reason, it's something that often goes unnoticed. And I think it makes it hard for us to measure and respond to it, because most people don't want to believe that using their phone can be having such a negative effect on their health. And I hear people saying, I'm okay, I don't use it that much. But okay, when we compare generations, which Twenge has done in her research, we can easily observe changes in the use of technology, and the conclusions become much easier to accept, I think. And the conclusion is quite stark. The more time you spend on your phone, the greater the chance you'll experience poor mental health, which is, it is a stark conclusion, that.
Do you think that that's, I completely agree that you can't just really attribute it to the actual device itself, to a smartphone or to your computer. But do you think it might be some of the way that sometimes it feels like we're being manipulated by that technology? Because I always find that, and again, it's only recently that I've started noticing this, in that if I haven't used my phone, and I've taken steps to try and like reduce my phone use, just because I found that I was always checking it, or always on my WhatsApp or checking my emails. And I find that if I'm not using my phone, I'll start getting like notifications up. I'll get like a ping and it'll immediately grab my attention, and I'll start to fall back into that habit. And it's just, but the actual, like, the idea of all that technology is still fantastic. Like, things we can do with it, like the fact that I can access, practically 1 million books on my phone if I wanted to, and learn about whatever I want from the comfort of my room. That's amazing. But how can something so great also then be, leading people to suicide and depression? And
yeah, it's I think it's an important one to acknowledge, isn't it? The fact that this isn't just, right, if I use a phone, I'm going to get sort of ill or whatever. That's not what I'm saying here, and certainly what Twenge is saying. But I think the point you raised there about, the use of this technology, and almost that we're craving more and more of it, really, it is very, very well designed. I watched a Netflix documentary a while ago called The Social Dilemma. Once you watch that, it's quite scary, really, because you've got the people who developed this technology acknowledging what you've said there about the fact that, it potentially is not only holding our attention, it's holding our attention in such a way that, it's very difficult to break free from it. So, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, it can be useful, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that it's extraordinarily powerful as well, technology. And it's a little bit like, for me, sugar. Sugar is great in small quantities, but the more we consume, the more we want to consume, and all of a sudden then it becomes very, very addictive. And I think phones are the similar. We can use it to maximize maybe certain things in our life, connection, certain types of connection, work, or whatever. The technology is fantastic. Let's not deny that. But I think it's finding a healthy way to use it. I think that's the challenge. That does this technology allow you to use it in a small way? I don't think it's set up for small usage. It's set up to hold your attention for long periods. And that longer sort of attention grabbing effect of it is probably where the problems occur. As older individuals, which I'd have to put myself in that bracket, I grew up without this technology, and I find it easier then to step back. But I wasn't going through adolescence with a phone.
yeah,
So those critical maybe stages of development, thankfully I was spared this, because I think I would have really struggled with it. I mean, I found growing up quite hard as it was, but with technology, I think I would have found it extraordinarily difficult. But I think I find it easier to sort of step back from it, really. But it's extraordinarily well designed. There's no question.
just made to be addictive, really. Well,
Yeah.
and if you think it makes sense, because it is a business, isn't it? They want your attention for, for advertising revenue and for everything else. But there's lots, I guess, just hearing you talk about that now, and that I'm starting to realize, even those things like, if you are watching Netflix, and you're watching a series, you're way more likely to binge it, not just because it's there, but I feel like it has that like autoplay. I don't know if anyone else has seen that, where you're watching an episode, and then even before it's like finished ending, it's like next episode in 5, 4, 3, and it just launches it straight away. So it's just so easy to just get sucked in, and you sit down there, and
it's powerful. It's so powerful. It's interesting that what you just said there, because it's one of those things I've noticed without noticing that what you just said. The fact that it sort of does grab you, and we do tend to binge watch things now. That's a really interesting one, actually, because it's I suppose it's part and parcel of a technological revolution that's designed to hold our attention, and it's doing it really, really well. But I think the other thing that strikes me about all this is that, and I think this would be my take-home message as much as anything else, certain addictions, I think, are extraordinarily powerful. And whilst you could loosely classify the use of our technology as an addiction, I don't see it as an addiction in the broader sense. I think addictions largely stem from, they start and end in the same place with pain. So I think if someone's in pain, I think they turn to whatever, whether it was alcohol, an illicit drug, whatever it was, there's a whole host of things to alleviate the pain, and that's where the addiction develops. I think the use of technology probably isn't in that bracket, even though it's extraordinarily well designed. I think 3 weeks with reduced exposure to technology, and we can start to feel better. And there is some evidence, the Twenge cites about this. And, I think about that, that really puts us in control of this. So, in a very short period of time, if we could put our phone down for a period, we'd probably start to feel a lot better. And whilst this rule isn't set in stone, if we can limit our smartphone usage to maybe 60 to 90 minutes a day and only use it for essential things, okay, then I think that would make a huge difference. And if we're trying to constitute, right, what's essential smartphone usage? Well, consider anything that we could do face to face that you're not currently doing, right? Use your phone for what you need, but don't use it when you don't have to, kind of thing. So I think it has addictive properties, but not in the same way that some of the deeper addictions might lie. And I think that's a really important distinction, because we can step back from this. We can do something about it if we can go past that initial sort of phase of stopping, right, can I put it down for a couple of hours a day, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It does. I mean, I've started, me and my wife have introduced like a couple of rules, and it's fantastic. Like the difference that it's made already for me. So we don't have our phones in the bedroom, so that you can't go to sleep with that phone in there. And you wouldn't think it would make that much difference, because we weren't really on it when we were in the bedroom anyway, but we'd often bring it in and use it as an alarm. But my sleep has just improved like an insane amount. Like I sleep right through. I don't really wake up anymore. I kind of like wake up with the light, don't use an alarm. And not having it near us when we're having dinner, or if we're watching something on the telly, or just having it away from us, it has that real, like almost like that feeling of liberation, kind of like when you go out without it as well. If you go to the beach or you go for a walk and you've just left your phone at home, you actually feel that level of disconnecting, or at least I do.
I think we've said that we'll be liberated, right? I think it's a really powerful message, Paul, because you've an agreement that you were not going to use your mobile phone in sort of take it into the bedroom kind of thing. And I think that simple rule has allowed you then to detach from it at maybe a critical period in the day, maybe those period, the hour or two before you go to bed. And then you said you sleep in bed, and my sense is you sound like you feel a lot better. You're waking up more naturally, so you wake up and maybe in a better mood. And you think about from a health point of view, right, how a simple change has led to, right, okay, a really positive effect on your health, kind of thing. So I think that's a really, really important message, because it's such a simple change that, but really big impact.
And it is. I'm like, since doing this now, like we've persuaded a load of our friends to do it, and they, like, every one of them have now reported out we've all got like a no phone in the bedroom policy. And even with like things like when I'm writing now, I used to struggle a little bit with a writer's block, and now I feel like without my phone I'm not distracted, and I do get bored, but then I start thinking of things. Like my brain just kind of seems like it now clicks into gear, and my imagination just kind of like takes me out where I need it to go. And I think that's a lot of it was just I was constantly being overstimulated and distracted, and now I'm starting to get to the point where I don't enjoy having my phone near me. Like we ask each other, do we need the phone to go out the house? Oh, we're actually going for a fair bit of walk. We better take it just in case something happens. And it really is phenomenal, that feeling. But the first couple of days, even, you think, it's only like half hour while you're having dinner. But I found my hand like twitching, wanting to go and just, play the lottery of the news feed, swiping up just to see what else is going on in the world. And it took about maybe like 3 or 4 days of having dinner without it before I started to relax.
But it was a quick turnaround, wasn't it? But what you described, and I wonder whether, people could build on that message, because if you can maybe develop a contract. So I'm just thinking about a young person here, teenage years kind of thing. Friends are very important. Social connections are hugely important, probably more important than they would be for someone who's older like myself. If you could develop a contract with your friends, look, we're going to stay off our phones here for maybe, between, I don't know, after 9 o'clock, for example, all right, in the night. Think about how powerful an impact that could have, where you start to sleep better and you start to feel a lot better. And I think, again, it's a really good example there of a simple change in your life, how that could really, really benefit. And I understand it's difficult because, growing up with these phones, it becomes part of your life kind of thing. So I do get this is a challenge, and maybe people are thinking, well, look, I don't need to do this. And I suppose ultimately nobody has to do it, but I think a small change you've described there can have a really powerful impact for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% encourage anyone to take that first step to doing it, even if it's 10, 20 minutes away when you normally be on it, and you will feel the difference if you stick at it.
And I think, there's no doubt when you step back from it, you almost described the void, Paul, there, right? Okay, where you're almost craving it. And I think we can fill that void with other things. You mentioned exercise. You can look at hobbies maybe you haven't or don't currently do, even potentially volunteer when we are maybe COVID safe to do it. You can sort of start to take on these healthy outlets, I think, and really invest in your own health in that way. And I think the other thing alongside this I've noticed over time, particularly maybe when it comes to achievement situations, and education, I suppose, is one of them. I've seen something similar in industries like sport as well. With anxiety will come avoidance, and with avoidance, people try to make themselves feel safe, which means they avoid taking risks. And whilst we've all got a different relationship with risk, I think if we can find a way to expose ourselves to situations and make us feel, almost taking some calculated risks, being prepared to take on challenges, almost daring to fail. I think, that's a sort of a path here that can be really healthy. Whilst we can feel a bit uncomfortable with it, at the end of it, we can generally grow and it probably feels stronger.
Nice. Some wise words there, Mike.
So I think that's pretty much me done here, Paul, I think.
Yeah, no, perfect. Well, I just want to say thanks so much for taking the time to speak. And I know I found it helpful, and I'm pretty sure a lot of others will too. So thank you again.
Thanks for your time, Paul. Thanks for taking the time to put this together. Really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Not a problem.